Welcome to Gwinnett County Public Library. My name is Amy Perry, and I'm an Adult Services Specialist here at the library. Thank you for joining our programming, Understanding Generational Trauma Through Literature and Archives. Tonight, our moderator is Radha Ashok. Radha is the branch manager at our Swanee branch, and she's been with the library system for 22 years. Please welcome Radha.
Today we have Anjali Enjeti with us to talk about her book, Pottered Earth. Welcome, Anjali. Anjali Enjeti is a former attorney, organizer, and journalist based near Atlanta. She is the author of Southbound, the essays on identity, inheritance, and social change. Pottered Earth is her second book and a total fiction that she has found. She is the recipient of 2022 Georgia Author of the Year Award for the first novel, a gold medal for the best regional nonfiction from Independent Publishers Book Awards, and is a finalist to the 2023 Townsend Prize for the fiction. Congratulations, Anjali, on getting this award. Her writings appeared in Los Angeles Times, Atlanta Journal-Constitution, the Oxford American, and other publishings. She teaches creative writing in a couple of universities in Los Angeles. She is a former board member of the National Book Critic Circle. Thank you for joining us today, Anjali, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to talk to you about your Pottered Earth.
Thank you so much, Radha. It's such a pleasure to be here and to be in conversation with you tonight.
So, can we have some context based on which this book has been written?
Absolutely. Thank you for asking that question. So let me start at the beginning. The British ruled India in one form or another for about 200 years. At first, it was the East India Company, very much an economic colonization. And then the British Crown took over for another just under 100 years. And for decades, Indians were working together to try to force the British out, and then became successful in 1947. The British left. And before they left, they decided, along with some leaders in the subcontinent, to divide the subcontinent into a Hindu majority nation and a Muslim majority nation. The Hindu majority nation is what is now known as India today, but it was the first time it became a nation state. Prior to partition, India was made up of a series of kingdoms. And then the Muslim majority nation became Pakistan. Actually, it was Pakistan, but it was East Pakistan in what is today Bangladesh. And West Pakistan is what we know of today as the nation state of Pakistan. This division, though, came at a tremendous cost of the people living in the subcontinent, because roughly 15 million people found themselves stranded on the wrong side of the new border. Hindus and Sikhs found themselves in the new Pakistan and needed to make their way to India. And Muslims found themselves in the new nation state of India and needed to make their way to Pakistan. This event is actually what is known as the largest human migration in history. And it also resulted, unfortunately, in a significant amount of bloodshed. Somewhere between 1 and 2 million people perished in the aftermath of partition. You know, today, even, there are still survivors alive telling their stories about what they lived through. They spent the next several years trying to establish homes in their new country after losing everything, losing ancestral homes, other types of valuables, and the culture that they had established, and the traditions that they had established for generations in the homes that they lost. And, you know, it's been 75 years. Last year was the 75th anniversary of partition, and it's an important world event that sadly not many people who do not have ties to South Asia know about. It was something that I grew up not hearing much about at all. I was born in the US. My father is originally from India and immigrated here in 1971. In the education that I received in the United States, I learned nothing about partition. I mean, when you think about it being the largest human migration in history, that's something that should be taught, right? But I was a child of schools in the 1980s and 1990s and learned nothing. I remember one of my first, I'd heard about partition from a few people, but was not really familiar with it until I was in high school, and I watched Richard Attenborough's movie Gandhi, where I learned about some of partition. I read a book, an old dusty paperback in my parents' office by Dominique Lapierre called Freedom at Midnight. It was a nonfiction book. And then found myself in college and then in law school, becoming very interested in learning everything I could about partition, simply because I didn't know anything about it. And I thought it was as important as every large event in history that I'd been learning, you know, like the Vietnam War, like the Holocaust, and could not understand why it wasn't taught. And so that sort of began my journey, not as a writer, interestingly enough. I actually was not even interested in being a writer when I became interested in partition. I just became obsessed with this catastrophic period of history that I knew nothing about. And I spent the next 15 years reading everything I could about partition before I even considered writing a novel about it.
It is so true that there are many incidents that has happened after 1947, after the Indian independence, that is not portrayed in the history. That is so true. And thank you for bringing that perspective to the next generation and the generation after through a beautifully woven fiction and a history together. It's a beautiful reading that you had. You said you did not start writing the book when you read about the history of this book. When did you actually start writing?
So I probably started my sort of intense study about partition began probably in about 1995. I was starting law school. Again, did not consider myself a writer. My first job out of law school was across the street from a wonderful public library. And it is there where I checked out Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children, a book that many people have probably read. It's a wonderful book on partition, one of many books on partition. And I then started going to the library regularly and asking the librarians for anything they had on partition. Now, in 1985, I had just begun using the internet. I was, really new to it. And so most of my source materials were from libraries and bookstores. And so I read everything I could get my hands on. And then when I began getting more comfortable, I started doing my very first internet searches were on partition, literally just putting, I think it was AOL that I was using back then, literally writing partition 1947 in the search bar and reading anything I could. I started finding newspaper articles that were written in the subcontinent leading up to partition and then after partition, chronicling the migrations, the violence, even the wars that came later. And I found all of it fascinating, but I felt that there was a dearth in the materials that I was coming across. Keep in mind, I was a very amateur researcher and sort of stumbling into the internet for the first time. What I found, though, was that there was a lack of firsthand, lengthy testimonies of people who lived through partition. So I'd read a newspaper article and I'd see a quote here and a quote there from a survivor. Not much else. I wanted more. I wanted more detailed, in-depth accounts, and I couldn't find any. So I spent the next 15 years reading everything I could, with the exception of one book, and I think I have it here, that had really lengthy counts of survivor stories. It's this one. The other one is Silence, right?
Yes.
Are you familiar with this one, Radha?
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
I am. Yes.
Wonderful book.
Yes.
The author, she had family members who survived partition, but ended up being stranded on both sides of the border. But she interviews more people than just family members. So I read this book I think it came soon after it came out. I got a hold of it. Published in 2000 by Duke University Press. I read Butalia's book probably a year or two after that.
Mhm.
I thought, wow, this is finally like some meat here about what these people went through.
Yeah.
And I still did not think I was going to write a book. I really was not a writer then. I was going from one attorney job to a new attorney job, and I was just reading about partition because I was interested in partition. Fast forward until about 2010, 2011. Two things happened. I went to India for the first time after 19 years. I had not been. This was for a few reasons. One is because many of my Indian family members left India. My generation of first cousins no longer lived in India. So all I had left were a few elderly relatives, but I had the opportunity to go back to a cousin who was Australian, but who was getting married in India, and I went back. And it was when I went back for the first time since my grandparents had passed away. And I felt this new raw grief for them. Because by then my grandmother had passed away about six years earlier. My grandfather had passed away for many years. And I just felt this longing to be connected to my grandparents. And I was carrying this around with me all through India. And this fresh grief for my grandmother's death after I'd been sort of walking around and doing things that I used to do with her. The second thing that happened was that same year, I discovered the 1947 Partition Archive, which is a nonprofit organization started by a wonderful woman, a physicist actually, named Gwinnett County, who was based in the San Francisco Bay Area and who had family members who had survived partition. And she had been trying to make trips back home to video record her family members' stories of survival during partition. She got a few of them down, but was not able to record the story of her great uncle in time. He had passed away. And the regret of not getting down his story caused her, when she came back to the Bay Area, to start visiting community members and talking with them about their stories of partition and recording them. And that was the birth of this nonprofit organization that has trained citizen historians around the world to record the stories of partition survivors. I believe they have over 10,000 stories now. But it was when I discovered the existence of the archive and the importance of the archive and the fact that the archive happened, over 60 years after partition, right?
Correct.
We can think about millions of stories have been lost when you wait 60 years to document, right?
Yeah.
And it's not to say that nobody was documenting partition stories up until then. There were much smaller efforts by organizations, by university professors in India. They were documenting stories, but they did not have the financial backing that this organization had, and the breadth of the depth of the people that they were able to get on board to record these stories. But over 60 years passed, which means millions of stories were lost, which means millions more descendants did not know their family stories about partition. It was when I discovered the archive and learned about what they did and began reading survivor stories that I got the idea for the novel. So from 1995 to roughly 2010, I was reading what I could find online and in print and in newspapers about partition. It wasn't until I found out about the archive that I thought, I'm going to write a story about a family, a grandmother and a granddaughter who are estranged, and the granddaughter does not understand that she has roots in partition, that in fact the reason she is estranged from her grandmother has to do with the fact that her grandmother suffered tremendous traumas during partition and hasn't anyone. So it wasn't until the archive, I discovered the archive, that the entire story then came to me.
That absolutely shows how much of research you had done to bring this book to us, because the intricacies of Delhi streets, the intricacies of how the riots went through in Delhi, the intricacies of how people were trying to board the train and go to Lahore, that is absolutely breathtaking, because you have put your efforts to find every details in there. And when I read through them, I could picturize the place. Even though I was also not from that generation, I could picturize Delhi, I could picturize Lahore, how people had struggled there. Thank you for telling us about your journey there. Let's start with the book itself. How do you connect yourself to Deepa and Shauna and Chandni? Which is the closest character that you connect to?
Oh, that's such a tough question, Radha. So the longing of not knowing one's history, which is what the character Sean is about, is not something exactly that I have like her. I do have other parts of my heritage and my history that I don't have a connection to. So I'm very close to my Indian heritage and my Indian family members, but there are but I'm mixed race, mixed ethnic. There's another side of my family that I have a longing for because I am not connected to them at all. So that desire, that hunger that the character Sean has of feeling like she isn't rooted, feeling that there's so much that she never knew about her father who passed away when she was a child, the confusion she feels about this grandmother Deepa, who she's never had a relationship with, that I feel with a different part of my family line. So I would say that emotional kernel that Sean has in me, I feel. Then the part of Deepa, of this character who was traumatized as a child, because Deepa, as we know, she was 16 years old when she basically lost everything during partition. That comes from a lot of people I've talked to, not even just people who survived partition. I'm talking about people who survived wars and genocides from any part of the world, who are so traumatized about that event that as soon as they were safe again, they never talked about it again. They never shared it with their family members.
Exactly. That was Deepa.
That's Deepa. Yeah. Deepa is sort of a culmination of not only people who survived terrible things and who wouldn't talk about it, but their children and grandchildren who walk around with this longing of knowing who they are and where they come from, and can't know it because their ancestors, their aunts, their uncles, their grandmothers, their grandfathers who lived through a tragedy weren't able emotionally to share it with them. So those characters kind of come from pieces. Now, the character of Gertrude is probably most heavily based on a real person in my life. My maternal grandmother was Austrian. Her name was actually Gertrude. I tried very hard, Radha, to actually change her name for the novel, but I couldn't because she resembled my grandmother so much. So my Austrian grandmother actually is a survivor of World War II. She was 14 years old and her younger brother was 12 years old when their house was bombed by the Nazis when they were invading Austria. She was, kidnapped by the Nazis and had to work in a Nazi work camp in frigid temperatures, doing very hard manual labor until liberation. Gertrude, as we know from the stories, her father is taken away by the Nazis. Someone turned him in because he was listening to Radio Free Europe, and he did not want Hitler to take over Austria. And that happened to my great grandfather.
Wow.
He ended up eventually in a Russian prison and almost died there, but thankfully survived and was reunited with his family. So there are a lot of details about the character Gertrude, who very strongly resembles my grandmother, who unfortunately was not alive to even know that this book existed. And for people who are confused, maybe some people listening in are very confused about why there's an Austrian character in this story. Gertrude's story as a refugee from Austria, who ends up in London, where Deepa ends up, they become friends. And even though they come from very different cultural and ethnic and racial backgrounds, they actually have a fair amount in common. Both of them lost, their families due to this catastrophic event happening in their domiciles. So they build a friendship, and the character of Gertrude, as a result, is very similar. Her personality comes very much from my grandmother. So that character of all of them probably is the one most closely based on a real person.
I wanted to ask you about your 3 different parts of the book. Did you think through it that you will be weaving 2 different time periods back and forth? Is it based on your way of thinking on it, or is it because of the incidents happening that way?
Wow, what a great question. So I do a lot of reading myself, and I have always gravitated to sort of the epic family novels, right? Novels that trace families through the generations.
Yes.
And two novels, these are just 2 examples of novels that I was just really fascinated with their structures. Again, I read them way before I even had the idea for this book.
Yeah.
One of them is Sarah's Key. That might be familiar to some of our readers. And Sarah's Key, and the author's name is escaping me. Tatiana de Rosne, I think is her name. Tatiana de Rosne, don't quote me. So Sarah's Key is a novel that primarily takes place in 2 different time periods. One is during the Holocaust, particularly when the Nazis invade France and the French police turn over the Jewish citizens to the Nazis, right? And all these folks end up in death camps.
Yeah.
It also takes place, the other storyline is a journalist who is working, I think in the 1980s or 1990s, doing a story about that event in history when the French police turned over Jewish people to the Nazis to be murdered. So that author does like a few chapters from the point of view of Sarah, who's living during the Holocaust, and then the present day character, the journalist. She goes back and forth like that to tell the whole story.
Yeah.
So initially I thought, wow, what a cool way to tell a story. I will try to make The Parted Earth look like that. But then I also read a book by Jess Walter called Beautiful Ruins, which I loved. I think that book, if I recall, goes like several more decades than Sarah's Key. I want to say it covers a good 60, 70, 80 years in time. tracing events happening in Italy all the way to the present day to the United States. So I was really fascinated with how that author put together a timeline and linked all these characters together. So between those two books, I mean, I became a student of them. I studied them. I looked at their techniques. I looked at their jumps in time. I tried to see how books that covered so many decades could read in such a cohesive way, in such an urgent way, in a manner that allowed the reader to actually follow the storyline. So when I tried to implement those exact structures, though, to my novel, it didn't work. I couldn't get it to gel. I felt like the book felt really too fragmented. And I just felt too that because so many readers reading the book would never even have heard of partition when they picked up The Parted Earth, I needed to start the book in the time of partition so that I could at least give them a sense of what this event was and how it was unfolding. So then I decided, okay, I'm going to start, the first section is going to be all about Deepa. And it's going to be all about what's happening in 1947 in New Delhi. Then I thought, then I will go to the second section, which will be Shanthi Johnson, who is living in Atlanta in the present day, right? Roughly 2015, 2016.
2015, 16, yeah.
Yes, thank you. I haven't read my own novel in a while. Thank you, Radha. And then I thought, but there are so many characters that are responsible for Sean's journey in searching for her grandmother, Deepa. And I didn't want that to be exposition, meaning I didn't want sort of Sean to be the one always having the point of view and sort of recalling her conversations with these other characters. I wanted those other characters to have a voice. I wanted to speak from their points of view, which is why we have characters like Gertrude, characters like, you know, Chandani, who I was like, Chandani is a very pivotal character. She's a minor character in the novel, but she's pivotal in Sean's life. And she's the one who really gets Sean thinking about the Indian heritage that she does not have a connection to at age 41 because she was raised by her white mother. So I thought these characters, even though they're minor, I want readers to really be able to get in their head and get to know them. So then I decided to write from their perspectives. And so part one and part two is mainly Deepa and mainly Sean. Part three, though, is an amalgamation of all the characters that are sort of responsible for helping Sean on this journey. But then what we learn is that Chandani actually is on a journey that she doesn't even know she's on about partition, parts of partition that she had no idea affected her life to the degree that it had. So the two of them end up essentially helping each other figure out the answers to their pasts.
You have beautifully woven the guilt feeling of all of the women and coming out of the guilt, because Shauna is able to trace each of their feelings and the traumas that they have gone through. Do you feel that each of them handled the grief differently? And how did they all handle it differently? Like, let's go on the male characters that we have in the book. Vijay, how did he handle his separation from India and Lahore? And how did Harjeet come out of it? Because Chandani comes to know Harjeet's feelings only after he had passed away, and they found the video.
Yes.
So what do you think about their emotional feelings and grief that they went through?
So, Radha, when I started writing this book, one of the things that was most important to me was to show the very diverse reactions to tragedy and trauma that these characters were going to experience. I did not want to write a book that had a happy ending for all of these characters. I wanted to be truthful to what it was like for many survivors. And I wanted to make it clear that not everybody gets a happy ending. Not everybody recovers in the sort of stereotypical way, right? Or the, when you see a film or a movie, right? At the end, there's a big reunion and everyone is happy and everyone is healed, right? Because the truth of the matter is that not everyone has the opportunity to heal during their lifetime. Not everybody achieves a sense of peace. Not everyone can overcome. I'm not a fan of that word anyways, but not everyone can overcome the trauma that they've experienced. And so I felt that I was going to do my absolute best to honor these survivors and honor those who passed away during this horrific time period by bringing characters to the novel that were feeling whatever they were feeling and dealing with it in a way that many people deal with things. So, for example, Vijay, he is a character that is rash, brash, makes a decision that very negatively affects his little girl by abandoning her where she's living with her mother in Seattle and up and moving to India, a country he's actually never set foot in, right? Does this make sense? He is haunted by not knowing his identity and not knowing who he is. And so he very suddenly makes this decision. Parjeet, I mean, he is a character that puts a brave face on no matter what, despite the fact that on the inside, he is completely falling apart. And he carries so much shame about what happened to his family during partition, that he cannot even share it with the wife that he's been married to for half a century. And his wife, Chandani, she was an infant, right, when the aftermath of partition is happening. But she still had enough family members that were tremendously impacted by it. And she was raised in the aftermath of partition. So, and then there's Deepa. There's Deepa, who has just completely decided to seal off her entire life from partition as if it didn't happen at all. And she is going to seal herself off so completely to what happened during partition that she is not even going to tell her own son who his father is. And her son is then haunted with that question for the rest of his life, a life that ends up being short so that he doesn't even get a chance to learn anything during his lifetime. So, there are other characters, obviously, that have, I don't want to give everything away, but not everybody has a sad ending. But I wanted to be true to how trauma affects people over many, many years. And I wanted to show all the different ways it affects people. And I think there is really, there's a lot of honor in how people cope with what they go through. And there's certainly nothing wrong. And there's nothing wrong with a person who cannot ever get past a moment of trauma in their lives. And I wanted to honor that. I wanted to honor those people who actually can't go on. Because I think those folks become invisibilized in our society. Right. Because we don't hear their stories. We assume that they're okay. We assume that they made it out all right and that they healed. And actually quite a few of them didn't.
The women characters in this book have all lost their family. and the emotions that they go through is really connecting to the people who would have gone through any type of separation. So, as you said, partition did not just affect Deepa, but it did trickle into Shauna. It did trickle into Chandani, and it is eye-opening for us to know that an world event does not stop with that generation. It continues to the other generation. And when somebody tries to find the root, that's when we realize the problem for the rest of the generations. That's what Shauna's character showed in this book. While she tries to find her grandmother, to learn about her feelings and stuff like that. How did you choose the names for all these characters?
Wow, that's a great question. You know, I know somebody named Deepa. That name came to me just because I've always found it to be a very, very beautiful name. Shanti, obviously, it means peace. And even though the peace achieved in the Parted Earth is a complicated one, that name carried meaning to me. Amir, I have a child whose name is not Amir, but whose name is from the same letters. And I have another child whose name is not Layla, but is always mistaken as Layla. And the name just grew on me over time. So a lot of them were names I just really liked, and I liked the meaning of them, and sort of when I put them all together on the page, they just made sense to me. But you know, Shanti, especially that name, you know, I wanted to sort of show in the book that, you know, peace is a very complex state of mind. And it is sometimes achievable and sometimes not. And for Sean, that means trying to discover and uncover her family's origins, and trying to sort of put the jigsaw pieces together of her ancestral history and of her heritage. You know, the character Sean, she's 41 in most of the novel, and she is just having one issue after another. She starts out having a pregnancy loss. Her marriage falls apart. She cannot get her footing in her 40s. I'm in my 40s. I'm actually almost 50. And one of the things that happened to me in my 40s was I started asking a lot more questions about my ancestors. I started realizing that I'd lived roughly half my life, and what don't I know, and what connections have been lost, and what family stories have been lost. So for Sean, you know, she is on this journey of trying to achieve peace in her life. She's lost her father at a young age. Her mother is no longer alive. She has a pregnancy loss, and she loses her family through divorce. So she is ready to find some kind of peace in her life. That's what sets her off on this journey to connect with her grandmother.
Your storyline always have a trail of poetry in them. So where did you get the influence of poetry? I know Deepa was into poetry a lot, and so her life continued to write poetry, and she was a lecturer in the college. So how did you get the idea or the influence of bringing in poetry into your book?
So I really love poetry. I am not much of a poet myself. I wish I had those skills more, but I don't. One of the things that I wanted to do in the novel was to show how people try to heal and try to make sense of their experiences through art. So Deepa had great difficulty expressing what she'd lived through. She wouldn't talk about it with anybody, but she is able to write poetry. She was writing poetry before partition, but it's really after partition that we learn that she is in fact a poet and has published poetry and teaches at the university level. Another character in the book becomes another kind of artist. I won't name her to avoid the spoiler, but she becomes a metals sculptor, and inspired by origami, which is another kind of art which is featured throughout the book. I know from talking from survivors of any kind of big tragedy that art is often a way that people work through trauma. It's often a way that they can find some kind of healing. And so art became a central force in the book. I wanted these characters who could not necessarily share their experiences with people in a blatant way, in an open way. I wanted to give them the opportunity to share their experiences through their art. And Deepa does that she doesn't do it any other way, but she does do it through poetry.
Poetry, yeah. That is great. Do you have any words that you want to share with us before I go into some questions?
Sorry, what was that? I missed that.
Do you have anything else to share with us before I start asking you the questions from the audience?
Not necessarily. I mean, if we've got questions from the audience, I'm happy to start there. If not, I'm happy to share other things about the book.
Great. How long did you take to write this book?
So from the time I started writing, I probably started writing the book in 2014. 2013. I think I started jotting down notes about the book in 2000. Wait a minute. No, it was 2012. I started writing the book in 2012. It was the first 2/3 of the book were my master's thesis. I entered in 2013 a Master's of Fine Arts in Creative Writing. And so the first third of the book was actually my thesis. Or the first 2/3 of the book was my thesis, which I finished in January of 2015. And then the book came out in May of 2021. So it was a fairly, I would say that's actually not even considered a long process for writers. That came out fairly quickly. I had written other books that didn't get published, so I was sort of used to writing book-length works and getting everything down and having a practice of trying to write X amount of words during X time and sharing the pages with people. It helped that I was in graduate school because I had deadlines that I had to meet. But yeah, roughly 7-ish years from the time I started the book until the time that it was published.
The other question is, there are several settings in this book, from India to London to Amsterdam. Did you get to visit these places to be so accurate in explaining those places and describing them?
So I have now, I've been to Delhi, I've been to Agra, I've been lucky enough to have gone to the Taj Mahal for several times. I had not been to Lahore. I've not been to Pakistan at all. I have been to Amsterdam. So I had been to most of these places. I've been to London. Certainly I live in the Atlanta area, so that was fairly easy. But I'm writing about a lot of these cities in the past. So my present day trips don't, they're nice to get some context, but I went back online. I was online and I was like, there are a couple of chapters that take place in London in the 1950s, right? I had to go back in time to look at that. There's a scene at the Taj Mahal in the 1980s. I had been to the Taj Mahal in the 1980s, and I remember what it was like to enter. They've changed that, right?
Mm-hmm.
They've changed the security process, and so I still had to go back online and find photographs and find articles to depict those areas. But trying to research setting is a very immersive experience. And even though I've been to most of these places, I was looking at, I was using Google Images, right? And YouTube, and finding any kind of footage I could find of these specific places, because even though I'd not necessarily traveled there during the decade where I was having that particular scene take place. So I did have to do, most of it came from research anyway, even though I had been to a number of these places.
You are an A+ researcher for sure. You have done a great job in explaining all those things. This is a question from Linda. What is that necklace you're wearing? Family tree, possibly?
Yes, so this is, the tree of life. Let me see if I can
Yeah, we
show
can see it.
It's the tree of life. I actually recently got it in Charleston, and I had a matching ring, but I forgot to put it on before this program. But yes, tree of life is, I just love the symbolism and the design, and I joke that it's going to be my tattoo someday, but I've been saying that for about 30 years and I still don't have any tattoos.
Which character in the book did you find it difficult to give the voice to?
Oh, that's such a good question. So all of them, and I will tell you why. They were all very, very, very difficult for me to give voice to. And again, it was research that got me there. I have not lived through anything like partition. I have not experienced that. And you can do all the research you want and listen to all the stories that you want, but you have to find eventually an emotional core in the character that you feel like you can step into when you write it. So Sean was probably the easiest, simply because she was roughly my age when I was writing the book and living in the Atlanta area. And Sean is also a mixed race character, and I am also a mixed race. So she was probably the easiest to step into. But I mean, I was not a Hindu living in 1947 in Delhi. And even though I am Indian and I've been to Delhi many times, and I had many relatives live in Delhi for many years, and I visited them there, the only way for me to step into a character like Deepa was through reading survivors' testimonies about partition, what it was like, where they were living, the chaos, there are scenes in Delhi where Deepa comes across a whole bunch of refugees sleeping on the street, right? And that was the time when there were all kinds of refugees coming from the new Pakistan, right? New Delhi was further north. So people flooded Delhi, as they did other cities that were anywhere near the border, the new border. Right. I had to find survivor stories, and none of the characters are based on a survivor story. They're based on hundreds of survivor stories of me just sort of picking out details from what they talk about and putting together a character in a way where I can figure out how to get into that character's mind, how to enter the mind. So I found all of them challenging, every single one of them. I mean, obviously a character like Gertrude was easier for me too, because she was loosely based on my grandmother, but really the rest of them were not based on any particular survivor story I read, any particular descendant who talked to me about their family history. It was really just a matter of figuring out where the story was going to go, and then imagining, based off of my research, how somebody would feel. At the end of the day, we know how people feel, and we understand and empathize with their experience because we're human beings, right?
Right.
And so once I saw these characters as human beings, as real people, once I made them full characters, right? Because they're characters beyond their tragedy, right? They have interests, they have goals. I mean, Deepa is a schoolgirl who's falling in love, in the novel. She's not
Yes.
just about the
She's
tragedy.
16, yeah. Mhm.
She's 16, she's writing poetry for her boyfriend. She's imagining, a life with him. She's, her school teacher's kind of the teacher's pet. She's a spoiled only child who's adored by her parents. She hangs out in her parents' medical clinic and loves to help them diagnose patients. She's got a full life outside of the tragedy that she experiences. And that's just something that I had to keep in mind with all of the characters. Yes, they're living through this horrific time in history, but they're actually also just normal people, right? Outside of the
Yes.
tragedy, they're normal people,
Yeah.
right? They have personalities beyond the trauma that they experience. So I needed to remember that even though I couldn't relate to exactly what they experienced, I could relate to them as just human beings who have bills
Right.
to pay and who, go to work and go to school and function in the world as all of us do.
Yeah. As you are a creative writing professor in a couple of universities, what tips do you have for young writers?
So my tip is that, first of all, anybody can be a writer. So I would encourage you, if you have an interest, please write. There are writers who are engineers. There are writers who are welders. There are writers who are baristas at Starbucks. Make the time to write alongside whatever education or whatever career you are interested in. You can do it. Anybody can do it. So I would first start with looking at what your local public libraries have to offer for writers. Public libraries are a great place. They have books about writing. They oftentimes have author events where you can learn tips from authors who speak about their books, but they also have possibly writing workshops and teach you how to do things like structure a novel, for example. Look at community organizations and clubs for writers and join those up. Many of these organizations, the membership is minimal. I moved to Atlanta 16 years ago. One of the first things I did was join the Atlanta Writers Club, a wonderful local organization with hundreds of members, monthly meetings. The annual fee is something like $50, but you get the most outstanding education about how to be a writer and how to publish your work through an organization like that. There are so many online groups. If you can't leave your home for whatever reason to meet people in person or to attend a meeting, look at Facebook groups for writers. Look at writers, follow writers on Twitter, follow writers on TikTok and Instagram. Those writers are often teaching online classes that you can take to learn how to write. It really is a matter of sort of just engaging in the online world of other writers. Follow them on Facebook or Twitter. They will likely give information in posts about how they got started and what their writing practice is like. So there's a lot of great information on how to get involved in writing online. Most of it is free. And for the things that aren't free, like 6-week classes, a lot of nonprofit organizations offer them at a very reasonable fee, and they have opportunities for scholarships. If you can't pay for the class, you can apply for a scholarship or for funding for that class. I think, it's gotten easier and easier with the internet to learn about how to get into writing and how to develop a practice and how to publish a book. And it became even more easy with the pandemic, when so many opportunities that were in person for writers who were just starting out moved online. So get online, get on social media, especially if you're not on social media. And a lot of people don't like to be on social media, but I'm telling you, your journey to being a writer will go so much more quickly if you get on social media, start following other writers, agents, editors, writing instructors, and you will learn so much information at your fingertips if you do.
I have a beautiful question here. Do you have an advice? This is a question from Shruti. Do you have an advice for writers who are thinking about tackling topics that may have roots in generational trauma, which are also personal to them, but potentially uncomfortable for the wider family to confront? How might writer treat this topic in a respectful but honest way?
Wow, that is a wonderful question and such a complicated question. So here's the thing. If you have not broached the subject with them, I would encourage you to practice with somebody else. But also, just because someone hasn't been willing to talk about what they went through in the past doesn't mean they won't talk about it now. People change, people get older, they see the end of their lives coming up, and they suddenly feel the need to share their stories. So I would just ask them openly. And if you feel more comfortable doing this in a letter, in an email, as opposed to a phone call, like they might feel put on the spot if you call them and ask them, but you could always send them an email so that they could, or a handwritten letter if they don't do email, so that they can actually read your request and consider it before getting back to you. But I would tell them very honestly, I am writing, let's say it's a novel. I'm writing a novel about, partition. I'm doing, or whatever it is that you're writing about. I'm doing a lot of research. I'm so interested in these stories. I've been reading articles, but, and I would love it if you felt comfortable at some point sharing with me what you went through. Give them options. We can do this any way you want to. We can do this over the phone, over Zoom, over email. We can do this over text, and say you don't want to put pressure on them, and it's okay if they don't feel comfortable, if you don't feel comfortable talking with me. Make it as open-ended as possible. Do not make any demands on them. Don't put pressure on them. Just ask them, tell them what you're doing honestly, and ask them if at some point, right? Don't give them a deadline. Don't tell them, I'm going to try to get this novel done by December 31st of this year, so I need to talk to you before then. No, you have to be very humble and very understanding if they say no. And keep in mind, they might say no today, but after they've had time thinking about your request, they might say yes 6 months from now. But you have to be willing to accept whatever their answer is. And if they want to share one part of what they went through, but not the other part, you have to be okay with that. You have to be like, that's fine. You want to stop here? We will stop here. We don't need to ever talk about this other stuff if you don't feel comfortable. Creating a safe space for the survivor has to be the utmost priority for you. And you have to do it in a way that gives them all the time and all the space that they need in order to have a conversation with you. And you also have to accept it and respect it if they don't want to talk about it, right? We want to make sure that we do not add to their trauma by having them share things that may re-traumatize them.
Thank you, Anjali. This is the last one for us. What do you hope this book can impart to its readers?
I hope that people know and understand that generational trauma is a very real thing. That whether you are coming from a family line rooted in partition or not, or some other world event, it is something that we're beginning to scratch the surface of. And I encourage everybody to, if they can, take some time to talk to their older relatives and offer them the space, if they desire it, to share their stories. You know, what we know of is history history is often made by people in power, right? It's made by governments. It's by, you know, if there's a war, it's made by the winners, right? People in power are who create our histories, but really, history is just family stories as well. And our family stories are oftentimes the most revealing and the most true of our histories. So take some, I hope people read the book and maybe take some time to consider asking some of the older relatives and their family members, what was your life like? Asking that one question, what was your life like, can really open up your entire history.
Thank you so much, Anjali. This was wonderful talking with you. And I enjoyed reading this book. I hope all of them read it and understand a piece of history which is not very popular or publicized, the part of partition that we went through after the independence of India. But thank you very much for a wonderful evening today. And I really enjoyed talking with you. It was an honor to know you.
Thank you, Radha. And everybody go check out and support Gwinnett Libraries. I was telling Radha earlier, before we started the program, I'm a Fulton County resident who for many, many years paid $30 annually to have the privilege of a Gwinnett County Library card. You can become a member of a library in a different county. So please support them and their programs. And thank you so much. It was such an honor to be here. And thank you to Amy, who set up this entire event.
Thank you to Amy and all the attendees for being here with us for an hour. We really enjoyed your company here. Thank you, Anjali, and have a great night, everyone. Good night.